Fools. Welcome back to another Formula Fools podcast. I'm David.
And I'm Skin.
And today we've got a bit of a different podcast for you because today's the 1st of May 2024, which marks the 30-year anniversary of Ayrton Senna, who is probably regarded as one of the greatest drivers ever in our sport. It's 30 years since he passed away.
Okay.
Yeah. So because of this, we're going to be releasing this week's podcast a few days earlier. Hopefully I can get it out on time. If not, I'll be using the alt line that I just recorded for the intro. So yeah, we're going to be getting this podcast out a little bit earlier just because we wanted to kind of do a bit of a tribute and a bit of a look into his legacy. I think we could call it.
It should be good. I'm looking forward to it, Dave. And yeah, I don't know a ton about Senna, to be honest.
We saw his film last week.
Yeah, that was great.
His film, the documentary about his life.
Yes, yeah, you showed me that. But I hadn't heard much about him at all before meeting you, obviously, as with most things in the F1 world. But so I suppose I've got a lot of questions about Senna. But firstly, how do you pronounce his first name? Because I've heard you lecture a few people about getting that wrong. So I'd like to get it right, if you don't mind.
Well, luckily for you, Skin, and I have lectured a lot of people, including you and Lee, your brother, who works for us. Yeah, Lee's I'm his boss now.
Yeah,
he's my employee.
On the Fools, yeah,
exactly. Well, luckily for you, Murray Walker had a little bit of difficulty with this in the 80s, and so in an interview he did before his passing, he spoke about the pronunciation of Ayrton Senna's name.
The correct way to pronounce Senna's Christian name is Ayrton. And his actual full name is Ayrton Senna da Silva. And he dropped the de Silva because it's the Brazilian Smith, very common name in Brazil. And Senna wanted to be distinctive. So he used Senna, which was his mother's maiden name. I'd got into the British habit of calling him Ayrton Senna.
So you see, that's what a lot of people do, Ayrton. And I think when we were in Vinden last year, old mate, what was his name? Angus. He said Ayrton, and
that really grinded you.
I was off it. I was like, Murray Walker would not agree, mate.
But wait, that's a British thing, isn't it? Is it?
Yeah.
The Pommies started getting it wrong.
It's just kind of the Western kind of like pronunciation of it. Yeah, like Americans would probably still call him Ayrton. Most English people do as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, but it's Ayrton.
All
right, very good. So, secondly, what makes Ayrton so good? I suppose because not knowing a ton about Formula One, looking at his stats. I mean, I think he raced in Formula One for 10 years and won 3.
Yep.
World championships. Which is fine. That seems
it's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not like Max has won. He's winning.
He's going to win his 4th this year.
Yeah. It seems like he's going to do some winning. Lewis Hamilton's done some winning.
Yeah.
Schumacher did some winning.
Yeah.
So what is it that made Senna so good?
So I think if you're going to look at Senna's, if you're going to look at his stats like that and say like, he was in there for 10 years, only won 3, whereas you look at Lewis, Schumacher, and Max. Sebastian Vettel won 4.
Okay.
You're going to look at drivers like that who have all won multiple world championships since Senna. It's just very different. When Senna came into the sport, the difference between the front and the back, it's hard to believe because the difference between the front and the back now is huge, but it was bigger back then. There were some occasions where drivers back in the 80s or probably in like the early to mid 80s, the winning car would lap every single car on the grid. So like even second place would be a lap behind the leader.
Oh, wow.
It was very common because we had a lot of engine failures, fuel pump issues and driver mistakes, and tracks weren't as safe. So crashing off because of that. There was a lot of things that were kind of not going the way of the drivers. So if you had a dominant car and a dominant driver like Senna or like Prost, you could run away with it and dominate like that. The problem that Senna had is in his early career, he wasn't in a position to challenge for the victories. It got better as his career went on and led to what we have now and what Schumacher experienced in the mid to late 90s into the 2000s, where the field was a lot tighter. So even if you had the second fastest car, you could still win the world championship. Like Lewis's first world championship in 08. He probably had the second fastest car that year, but just his ability got him over the line, and that helped him to win that first World Drivers' Championship, even though he didn't have the fastest car. And so, yeah, you can kind of look at three championships in 10 years and think, oh, it's not that great, but he was only in a competitive car for maybe 5 or 6 years. So, 3 and 5 or 6, that's a lot better. I think when you look at Lewis's first 5 years in Formula One, he'd won 1 World Championship. In fact, Lewis's first 10 years in Formula One, I think he'd only achieved 4 or 5 at that point. So it's still very good, but it's not as, it's just different. The cars were different. The circumstances were different. We've actually got, we've got a little audio grab from Murray Walker again, talking about the best drivers and pretty much summarising what I've just said.
People ask me who is the greatest driver of all time, and to be honest, I sometimes give different answers depending how I feel at the time, because it's so difficult to compare drivers from one generation with drivers of another, because the circumstances were different.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that also doesn't take anything away from what Lewis, Schumacher, Seb and Max is doing. Like, it's amazing.
Sure.
But yeah, it's circumstantial, I reckon.
Okay, interesting.
Also, to also jump in. In 2019, it was 25 years since Senna's death. They asked the current F1 drivers on the grid who they thought their favourite driver was ahead of the season, and this is what a few of them had to say.
I think Senna, I will put him in number 1.
For me, Senna is number 1.
For me, he was number 1.
I will put Ayrton Senna as number 1.
For me, Ayrton Senna undoubtedly was the number 1.
I would put him number 1. He was definitely the greatest driver.
If you ask me, I put Senna as well in number 1.
The interesting thing about them last two, second to last, was Mika Hakkinen, who was, during your research, you've definitely heard the name Mika Hakkinen.
Yep.
He was I think a 2-time world champion for McLaren. Great driver, notably one of the best drivers of his time as well. Battled with Schumacher quite a lot, and they had a lot of famous rivalries. And the last driver there was Michael Schumacher himself. So after Schumacher, he was in Mercedes at the time, after his return to Formula One. And yeah, they'd kind of asked him the question. He said Senna is the best.
Right. Okay. So I guess Senna's sort of I get almost like your favorite driver's favorite driver, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then what was his driving style like, I suppose? I've heard people sort of talk little bits and pieces about him just apparently being ridiculously ruthless. Is that sort of part of what made him so good to watch? Or?
Yeah, just like Max is now. He was ruthless. He didn't take any shit. He wanted to win everything he was doing, no matter what it was, on and off the track. He just wanted to win. He was a competitor, and so yeah, he was quite ruthless. We've got a couple of examples probably coming up later in the pod, but yeah, he would always kind of do everything he could to win a race, or he would crash trying to win a race.
Yeah, right. Okay. He's kind of risked it all, I suppose. Yeah. And then people talk also about his attention to detail and his knowledge of the cars and just racing in general, I suppose. What was the approach of most drivers back then, I suppose, and was he different?
Yeah. So you kind of, to understand Senna's dedication, you've kind of got to go back to the 70s, where Niki Lauda was when he first went into Formula One as a paid driver and then moved into Ferrari and things like that. He would stay overnight in the garage with his mechanics and force them to stay instead of go out drinking, to improve the car, to change things on the car, to reshape bodywork, to change suspension, things like that, to make the car better. Niki was the first person we saw to do things like that, and it paid off. He won countless, not countless, I think it's 3 World Drivers' Championships, but he won countless races is where I was going to go.
Okay, sure.
Because of that just will to make it faster from a scientific, technical point of view. Mm-hmm. And Senna basically did the same thing. He had crazy amount of talent in the car, but he also knew that talent will only get you so far. Again, just like we see in modern day history, you also need a car behind you. So he would work very hard with his aerodynamicists, with his mechanics, with his strategists, and everyone that was in the garage. They would stay super late at night. They would stay overnight to improve the car, to work on the setup, to go through data. And he did this from his early days, from when he was karting through to Formula 3 and going into Formula 1 and things like that.
Right. Okay. And then he ended up sort of like, yeah, well, I guess it was all before my time, so I don't really know too much, but it certainly seems like he ended up becoming a bit of like a cult hero, essentially. Like he, particularly in Brazil, I think it's probably fair to say. Yeah. Is that because of the success that he had on the track and sort of just how talented he was and how good he was at all this stuff? Or
Senna was known for donating. Well, he was known to have worked a lot with charities when he was alive, but no one knew to the extent of which he worked with charities. And it wasn't until after his death that like the stats came out and people kind of found out that he had donated over $400 million of his own personal money to children's charities in Brazil and like charities that help with child poverty and things like that all across Brazil. That was his personal money. He just loved helping people. And that's really what kind of gave him that it kind of put him above everyone else around him, because he was this amazingly fast and ruthless driver, but then was also the kindest person on the planet. There's a fairly famous crash during his career where a driver has an incident and he blacks out in the car and he's like, his foot's on the accelerator. Senna pulls over to the side, jumps out his car and hits the kill switch on the engine, like turns the engine off, holds the driver's head straight until the doctors get there and everything, like genuinely saved this guy's life and risked his own by running across a live racing track to do so. Like the moment the helmet was on and it was racing, ruthless. But the moment there was, there was no competition, he was heart of gold. Okay.
So that's a fairly good sort of, I guess, overview of why he was such a big deal and why he's so loved by the F1 community. Yeah. But look, can you take me back to, I guess, like the start and how he got there in the first place, I suppose?
Yeah. So junior career for Senna, when he was real young, he was obviously born into a family of a fair amount of wealth, you've got to say, because racing is no cheap sport. And especially if you want to try and make it into F1 in the 80s, you need to, and you live in Brazil, you need to get to Europe somehow. So his family funded him fairly well. But he was karting in Brazil and before moving to Europe, and he would win a lot of championships over there. So he won the 97, he won the karting world championship for 78 and 82. And in 79 and 80, he was runner up in them competitions. He spoke about this in, I think, 92 or 93 in an interview, saying that it was some of the best racing of his life. So yeah, after that, in 1981, he moved to Norfolk, England. What a depressing place.
Is it?
Mate, Megan's mum lives there, so I'm allowed to say it. It's not the best. Okay. It's just like farmland. So he began his single-seater racing career when he moved there. And in I think it was that year or the year after. So in 81 or 82, he won the Townsend Thorson Formula Ford 1,600 championship.
Okay.
Very soon after moving all basically across the world. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So
and also didn't speak a word of English, was watching British television to pick up English. That's genuinely how he learned how to speak English, was just sitting and binging telly while he wasn't racing.
I guess that'll do it eventually.
Yeah.
Pretty slow process.
Yeah, very slow process.
Okay. So he's going all right.
Going very well. After that, he moved into the Formula Ford Championship in 82, and he won that one, obviously, because he'd won the thing prior. It was 81. So in 82, he won the Formula Ford 2000 Championship, which then got him promoted in 1983 to the British Formula 3 Championship.
Okay.
He did win his first championship in Formula 3, but it wasn't an easy championship for him. He kind of dominated the first part of the season and just kind of ran away with it. But then Martin Brundle, I think he came in as like a mid-season entry or something like that. I don't really know how it worked back then, but he came into the sport with he had a very good sponsor. They had a very good car. They were putting a lot of money behind Martin Brundle. Mm-hmm. And Martin ended up catching up with him, won a lot of races. They had a lot of very intense battles. And as we spoke about earlier about his ruthlessness, there's a fairly famous crash with Martin and Senna during this championship where Senna kind of dives down the inside very late. Like it was a stupid move, but he basically put his car there to say to Martin, like, I'm the big dog here. Kind of like, standing up and putting his shoulders out kind of thing. Martin ends up hitting him Senna ends up basically parking his car. They kind of like bump together along through to the gravel, and Senna ends up parking his car on top of Martin's head.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
You've seen the video of it,
yeah, I know. I've seen the video. It boggles my mind. I mean, what's the idea there? Like, he's essentially, I don't know, like he's essentially just forcing people to make a decision between letting him past and crashing.
Yeah.
That is wild.
It's just ruthless driving. It's but not in a bad way, in a way where it's like, well, it is kind of bad, but in a way that I love this kind of driving, because it's just like, you will literally do anything to win. He made Martin make the decision whether or not they were going to end up crashing. If Martin says in his own words, if he had backed out of that crash, he knew that Senna had won the mental game, because he just didn't care. He didn't care whether he wanted to, whether he was going to crash or not. Yeah,
right. I mean, yeah, you've got to respect the ruthlessness of it. But geez, don't love it, I suppose, so much when things go wrong. But,
yeah. But this is something that I think a lot of drivers go to. Like Lewis Hamilton in his early days was also described as being fairly ruthless and like doing things like this. Whereas now Lewis Hamilton is the calculated guy that only makes very good calculated moves and decisions during a race. And I think it's just most drivers that are good will probably go through this transition of like, you want to prove yourself and you probably get the ruthless reputation in your early days, and then you grow as a driver and as just a human and as a man or woman, and you grow up a little bit and kind of enter your older years a bit wiser. Senna would never have done moves like this in his 92, 93, 94 seasons, and any seasons that would have followed that had he not passed. So yeah, I think it was just he needed to prove a point.
Okay. So that was all in 1983 when he won the British Formula 3 Championship.
Yeah.
Then in 1984, he was straight into Formula 1, racing for Toleman, where he finished 9th.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. How was there any equivalent of Formula 2 back then? Like, how did he just skip that?
I don't think so, no. I think Formula 3 was your progression into Formula 1.
Okay.
Yeah, it was very different to what it is now.
Okay, interesting. And then how did he end up at Toleman? He was in discussions with a few other teams, and I thought he got offered some spots as like a test driver or something like that. But
I'm pretty sure McLaren was one of them. I think McLaren offered him a test driver role, which at the time, McLaren test drivers, I think between like the mid 80s through to like the late 90s, being a McLaren test driver was a very good job. You would get a lot of miles in a Formula 1 car, could potentially then progress into racing. And he just knew that he was kind of better than a test driver role, and he wanted to compete racing. He didn't want to just drive around on his own. And then, so how did he go that season? Firstly, Toleman weren't very good. How were they expecting to fare that year, and what ended up happening? How did it go for him? I don't think they were expecting to ever stand on a podium, certainly. It was definitely like a kind of Williams situation where they just wanted to try and get a few like bottom end points. Okay. Obviously Williams aren't doing that this season. So like it was that kind of situation. They were very underfunded. They were a stepping stone kind of team into the sport, and Senna knew that, and he was using that to his advantage. But one of the best races in that era of Formula 1 had to be the 84 Monaco Grand Prix. Senna in the Toleman was just like, they were kind of just getting by. Like he was getting good results all season. And then at Monaco, it was raining, and Senna was always good in Formula 3 and in the go-karts in the rain, but no one quite understood how good he was going to be in the rain. And this was kind of one of the defining races for him. So during the race, I can't remember where he started, but he was like real low down on the grid. And we had drivers on the track that were multiple world champions. Like Niki Lauda was still racing in the other McLaren. Like Alan Prost was already a world champion in the McLaren. And yeah, there was a lot of good drivers that he had to overtake. And he went from like real low down to overtaking and making his way through the field all the way up to P2. And then on the very last lap of the race, the rain got so bad that they decided to red flag the race. And Senna was chasing down Prost. But the controversy here is that Prost was kind of gesturing that the rain was bad to the stewards for them to stop the race. The stewards stopped the race. But the kind of controversy is that Prost did that because he knew Senna was catching him. Because you know the pit board things they put out, like the weird things they hang over the track on the start finish line? No. The big like cardboard things that they... Okay. Have you not seen them?
Don't think so.
Oh, I thought it was you that asked me about that the other week. So they just kind of have like these big like billboards that they kind of stick out, and it's got information on as the drivers drive past.
Right.
That was the only way that the pit wall could speak to the driver during the race. There was no radios back then. So every lap, Prost would see the gap from him to Senna was closing, and he didn't like that. So he kind of, used his influence at the time to get the race postponed. This is the way I look at it, and a lot of people look at it. The problem was that Prost pulled up to the start-finish line, red flag was there, checkered flag was behind it, and stopped. And Senna then powered on through and overtook him. I think on the commentary, Murray Walker is shouting, "Oh my God, Prost has won. What has happened? What has happened?" And then like very quickly says, "I think Senna has won." And then it very quickly goes, "Oh no, I think Prost has probably got that because the race was red flagged." Senna ended up finishing P2, not P1. I reckon he should have won the race. Prost never crossed the line, even though the race was red flagged. Prost got the victory.
Right.
Yeah.
But surely, surely if a race is red flagged, like say there was a red flag this season a couple of weeks ago in like at the very start of a race.
Yeah.
You have to go out and finish the race.
Yeah, but it was, so the 2-hour rule in Formula One where a race can't go longer than 2 hours.
Yeah.
It was closing in on that, and the rain was not going to stop. So they can, and they have done as in recent history as well, like end races, and depending on where they are in the race, hand out half points or full points, depending on where they are.
Right,
In the 2009 Brawn season, I think 2 races that season were red flagged and fully called off, and half points were given out. So it happens in Formula One if it's just too dangerous to drive, and that was one of the cases. But I would probably say that the rules we have now around red flags and races being ended was fairly influenced by what happened at this one. I would imagine this was like the beginning of putting a bit more emphasis on that rule, that section of the rule book. But at the end of that race, we did get an amazing piece of commentary from James Hunt, who is a British World Drivers' Champion who raced against Niki Lauda very famously in the 70s. And that goes a little something like this.
However, he's not about to be world champion this year. He will undoubtedly be world champion in the future if his career continues.
So that was James predicting that after that race, Senna would definitely be a world champion.
It seems like a big call at the time, but well done.
Well done to James.
Okay. And then the other thing of note from the 1984 season that I thought sort of highlights what you spoke about, like with his attention to detail. I mean, you probably more talked about it being on like the cars and making the cars faster, but I found this story crazy. I think there was so there's a race in 1984 where he crashed out, he's clipped a wall, come back and told one of the race engineers the wall moved.
Yeah. I think he said it in a press conference, and the press conference people were like,
which would,
yeah, sure.
Would just seem like the wildest, shittest excuse from someone ever. Like
from a rookie in the sport. He was his first year in the sport, so like still considered a rookie.
Yeah, and just like wildly like confident and arrogant. It reminds me of, I saw a video recently of Steph Curry like bouncing a basketball on the court.
Yeah,
and it like. And he just drops it. It just looks like he just drops it and fumbles it. And he's like, no, the floor's wrong. Yeah. There's something wrong with the floor. It's like, there's no way I made that mistake.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what it reminds me of. So he's come back and said the wall has to have moved. Like I drove it exactly how I always drive it. And I hit the wall's moved. Yeah. And they went out.
Because he clipped it like, it was a very fine clip, but I think it was enough to break the suspension, which caused him to retire.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they've gone out to check the wall, and someone else had clipped the wall, which made it pivot. And so it's like a few millimeters closer out onto the track than it should have been.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It is wild. But if that doesn't show, we talk about him making the cars faster, but if that doesn't show that God-given skill that you can clearly see in him from his karting days, like he was driving so perfectly that only the wall moving, that was the only thing that could mean he crashed there. There are also clips of him in his later career in 88, 89, 90, driving around Monaco, and like is genuinely going round corners in Monaco and touching the wall every single time. Like, not the wall, like the metal barriers. He's like touching them so perfectly that, because they'll only have like so much flex in them. And he's touching them so perfectly that the flex is just enough that it's not going to damage his car every single corner. And it's like, there are conspiracy theories around this, that his tire was going through the wall and like, God was helping him out, and like all these things that like he was doing this magic with the car. But it's as simple as he is so perfect with his driving that, yeah, the wall had to move.
Okay, I see. All right, so that was 1984 with Toleman, and then 1985, 86, and 87, he was with Lotus. Is that right?
Yeah, and can we just say, probably one of the best looking cars in history of motorsport.
You reckon?
The black and gold is just so iconic. The jackets that they wore as well. Oh my gosh.
Really?
You know how you see like the Ferrari and McLaren like retro jackets that people wear? Like they were everywhere at the Melbourne Grand Prix.
Yep.
I want a Lotus retro jacket. Probably won't happen because it has a massive cigarette sponsor on the front, but...
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So, and in those 3 seasons, I assume he went a little bit better there than he did with Toleman.
Yeah.
They're a slightly better team, but still no championship wins at Lotus.
Yep.
So he won 6 races in those 3 years and finished the championships 4th, and 3rd.
Yeah, Lotus were a team that were very good in the early 80s, like late 70s, early 80s, and at this point were on the decline. So big drivers had kind of moved on to Ferrari, McLaren, Williams, the big teams at the time. Up Williams. And yeah, Lotus was definitely a team on the decline. Funding wasn't coming in as fast. Sponsorship wasn't coming in as fast. And they were just kind of on a downward spiral. Senna saw this as an opportunity because he knew that even though they were on a downward spiral back then, if you had a good car in like, let's say 82, that car is still going to be good in 85 because it's going to be very similar. Whereas now, year on year, the car's going to be very different. I mean, fuck it, now it's still very similar actually. Mercedes built a good car in 2014 and then dominated for 8 years. Red Bull built a good car in 2021 or whatever it was, and they're still fucking dominating. It's the exact same. Nothing's changed. Basically, just rewatch the 80s. It's the same as now.
All right.
Yeah, so he knew that he could kind of like go to that Lotus team and overperform on what the car was going to deliver, but it was a good enough car that he would be able to get race wins and he would be able to actually like show his true potential.
Okay.
So yeah, during that season, probably some of his best, probably some of the best driving from someone so young in the sport.
Okay. And you were particularly excited about his first race win with Lotus in
Portugal.
85 in Portugal.
85, yeah.
Yeah. Why was that so special?
It's just one of them things that like, I remember my dad had taped this one. And so he had a VHS of it, or he had, I don't know, I think it was a VHS. I can't remember what it was, but he had some sort of copy of it. And I remember him showing us this lap and talking about it. And it was just phenomenal to watch it and hear my dad's passion talking about this, you know, him driving around the track. And also hearing Murray Walker commentate on it and James Hunt commentate on it and just say how, you know, on the edge that Senna was with the car. So something notable about the Lotus at the time is it had a turbo. It had a very big turbo in it. We've got turbos in the cars now. They perform very differently. Back in the day, you would need to, so let's say you've got your kind of turbo is separate to your engine. You would need to use acceleration to pump gas through tubes into the turbo to spin the turbine in the turbo to then give you the boost that you would get from a turbo. Yeah, that's like the basic principles of how a turbo works. Sure. Senna would do the craziest kind of throttle control in the Lotus car, which meant his car was always just on edge and like at any moment he could have crashed it. Because mid-corner he would blip the throttle and he would like he would like be off the brakes or on the brakes, whatever, and he would blip the throttle to keep gas going through and into the turbo to keep the turbo spinning, so that when he would drop the clutch or when he would then full power, he would then have the turbo at full pace so he could then power out of the corner faster and just have crazy amounts of speed, which is probably what led to his first race win in Portugal. People, if you watch the Senna documentary, people talk about him in the Lotus as like, they call it like what did they call it? They call it the dancing car.
Yeah.
Because it's just crazy. I've got the video here for you. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll pop it on screen.
Yeah.
But if not, just go Google it. It's amazing.
Who has had 2 pole positions in his career, is currently on target for the 3rd in his racing life. Senna. There's De Angelis behind him. got the wing set up.
So what we're looking for is like mid corners. You see them little twitches on his rear end and on his front end. He's kind of like look at him here.
As he comes up behind Felix.
That was a bad camera angle for it. But you see him kind of like, you see the car like twitching around and like looks real on edge and like real loose underneath him. It's because he's doing this crazy throttle control and like he's just driving it on the absolute limit.
I tend to think of him as being very experienced. Yesterday he showed a bit of an experience.
Look, see his rear end. Look, see that?
With the car, as it were, trying too hard.
And it's usually on the exits of the corner where you're seeing it the most. There is like he's exiting a corner, the turbo's spinning like crazy, and then he's flooring it.
Yeah.
And he's getting that boost. And that boost is kind of like, if you look at his positioning in the car, he's very far forward. And it's because everything is behind him. All the engine, all the turbo, all the fuel tanks, everything is behind him. So when you've got all of that power hitting your rear axle, it's going to, your rear is going faster than your front, and it's going to try and overtake the front of the car and by spinning you around. And so he's flooring it, getting this crazy boost from the turbo, and he's just having to manage and like shake his wheel and keep it under control.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I'd seen little clips of him driving in that period, and that's exactly what it looked like. I didn't think that it would be that simple, but yeah, it looked like he could literally spin out at any moment, doesn't it? He just never seemed to.
Yeah.
Quite impressive. And then, okay, so that was sort of his period for Lotus, 95 to 97, and then it was 98 that he eventually moved to McLaren, where he had really most of his success.
So in 1988, as previously mentioned, Senna moved to McLaren. It was McLaren Honda at the time, Honda being their engine supplier. And this was one of the probably the most famous livery in all of the sports history, the red and white. We've actually got it on a photo over here, the red and white Marlboro. Again, I'd love one of their jackets or a t-shirt like that, but it's a cigarette sponsor, so probably never going to see it.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. More famous livery than the Lotus, you reckon?
I reckon, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just because of what Senna and Prost rivalry.
Yeah.
I would say that made it super famous. And also it was there for so long. Like we had that livery for probably over 10 years, that same livery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's, probably as famous because of that. So he moved over there. Obviously, I've just mentioned Prost was his teammate, and in 1988, Senna got his first World Drivers' Championship, first of 3, as we've mentioned already. But it wasn't without. It didn't come easy to him. It was a very hard fought season. Prost, being already a world champion, did not make it easy for Senna, and did everything he could to stop him. Prost kind of knew he was going to have a challenge on his hand. He knew that Senna was fast, and he knew he wasn't going to help Prost out in any way like previous teammates had probably done for Prost. Like Lauda racing with Prost prior to this was probably helping him out a little bit because Lauda was at the end of his career and probably knew that he didn't have what it took to drive as fast as Prost did over a full championship. It led to a few awkward interviews, and luckily it's not really luckily, I went on YouTube and found it. We've got one of them interviews here, and it's just awkward.
Good fun. We will have good fun from now on.
Maybe we fight outside the car.
I think it's gonna get more and more exciting, the championship.
Is it possible to be equal? The championship?
No.
Shit.
Can only be one winner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, there you go.
That is some awkward laughter at the end there, isn't it?
Yeah. At the time, was it common, sort of the way teams now sort of seem to have like a lead driver and a
1 and 2
and a not lead driver? Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that a thing back then? How did both of these good drivers end up at the same team?
Mismanagement from Ron Dennis is probably what put them in the same team. I think some teams probably did have a 1 and 2 back then, maybe less so, less consciously than they do now. Probably more so that one driver like Ayrton would cost a hell of a lot of money to put in the car, and so teams didn't want to spend a ton of money on 2 really good drivers. Ron Dennis kind of saw it as, if I've got the best engine, I've got the best engineers, I've got the best designers, why would I not also have the best drivers? So he put the 2 of them together. He thought it was going to be a winning formula. I mean, it was a winning formula. Also for the fans, it was a winning formula because we got some of the greatest rivalry in history. But I would say Senna-Prost rivalry is what made teams focus on a 1 and 2 more, because I think they saw what happened there and saw the difficulties Ron went through to manage that relationship, and then said, we don't want to do that.
Sure.
But we've had famous examples in like recent history, like Nico and Lewis in 2014, 13, 14, 15, 16 was their last season together. Famously very similar to this kind of rivalry. Mm-hmm. It's probably something we need to look into, because there'll be a documentary of their rivalry, I reckon, because it was just as intense as this one.
Okay. And so in that season, the two of them obviously had a pretty big rivalry, driving in both in an equally good car.
Yep.
What was the rivalry like with the rest of the pack, or were the two of them sort of miles and miles ahead?
Yeah, they were miles and miles ahead. Not domination like what we see nowadays with Max. You would probably get Ferraris, Williams, and the occasional other cars winning because of mechanical failures, or because their car just didn't suit a track like it does, like it would most of them. But just because there was less data and perfectionism within the car design and things like that. So, they were definitely the faster of everyone on the field in terms of both skill and having the better car. But you would still see like Nigel win a few. You would still see whoever was in the Ferraris win some.
Well, in that particular year, I don't think you can be right anyways, because I'm pretty sure between the two of them, they won 15 out of the 16 races.
Go Diz.
So only one bloke.
Yeah, it's only one bloke. That's what I was saying is in that year, I thought we were talking about like over the period
over
of
those few years. Yeah. Okay.
But
Understood. Gotcha. All right. And in that particular year, 1988, wasn't Monaco an exciting? Like, there was some drama at Monaco? Well, Senna didn't end up finishing.
No, he didn't. No, and that's what the drama. That's where the drama comes from. In qualifying, Senna kind of he went out of the pits, and for some reason just had a fucking crazy helmet on that day, because he was driving like a man possessed. Like whatever that helmet was that day, it was not his normal helmet.
Was it different?
No, it's me joking.
Oh, right. Okay.
He went out and did a lap that was 1.5 seconds faster than Alan Prost in the same car.
Okay.
Obviously not the exact same car, but like the same machinery.
Yeah.
Back then, this didn't happen. Teammates were not that far apart, especially teammates that were so closely matched on skill. Like Prost and Senna were both very, very good drivers. Prost potentially in his prime at this point. So for Senna to go out there and beat him by that much was just unbelievable. And then in the race, he continued to do the exact same thing. Every lap was just dominating, was just making everyone else on the field look stupid. Like it was a crazy race. And can't remember what the exact thing was, but I feel like he was like 55 seconds ahead of Prost or something like that.
Okay.
And he had overtaken like most people on the field. And then coming like after the hairpin, coming down the hill before you enter the tunnel on the right-hander, he just kind of came around the corner and slid into the far left barrier on the exit of the corner, just next to the ocean. No one could understand why. The team had apparently told him either on radio or on a pit board to slow down. He didn't need to drive that fast, like save the engine kind of thing, which he says led him to kind of snap out of this unconscious state of driving that he says he was in, and he crashed into the wall. So yeah.
Okay.
Prost after the race was quite snarly about Senna's driving all weekend, and he actually was quoted saying, "He never wanted to beat me, he wanted to humiliate me." And I think he then went on to say like that was his undoing, is that he was trying to be so perfect or whatever. Senna says that he felt an out-of-body experience, like he was driving in a straight line tunnel the whole time, and anything he did, nothing would go wrong. And then when he received this message to slow down is when he kind of snapped out of it. And he talks about this kind of unconscious state that he felt where he didn't feel like he was driving the car.
Yeah.
Which is just crazy, because I would love to imagine people driving cars are driving the cars.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like what you hear other athletes talk about, like a flow state when they get in, where again, I keep going back to Steph Curry. I've heard him talking about it as well, like where he gets in like this just crazy routine where like as soon as the ball leaves his hand, he just knows it's going in. Like it almost doesn't matter what he does.
It's just like that on the NBA on the PlayStation as well. Because anytime Lee plays with him, I swear he can't miss a 3-pointer.
No, you're exactly right. Okay, but so that's twice now we've talked about like phenomenal things that he's done at Monaco.
Yeah.
Firstly with Toleman just sort of overtaking everyone in the rain, and now he's like flogging even Alan Prost, who's in an equally good car. But none of these things are what's always referred to as the lap of the gods. Is that right? The lap of the gods was not at Monaco.
No, it was at Donington Park, my home circuit. No, it's not. I see where you're coming from, because the qualifying lap that he did is, I think if you were to search Senna, this qualifying lap would probably come up first.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you watch the onboards of him racing around there, and it's like,
it's unreal.
Can't really imagine
anything
something being more impressive than this.
Yeah, it is. And also to think that like they didn't have paddle shifters like we have now.
Yeah.
So he was driving around Monaco at crazy speeds, taking his hand off the wheel to change gear on like a manual gearbox, and it's genuinely
still
unbelievable.
Coming in within that far of every wall.
Yeah, it's absolutely unbelievable. But no, it's not. It's definitely. That's his best qualifying lap, I would say, ever. I don't know, people might not agree with that, but it's certainly like the way that he flogged Prost is definitely got to be up there. But no, it's not considered the lap of the gods. Okay. We will get onto that in a little bit.
I'm excited to hear what the hell's so good about that lap then.
Yeah.
But it wasn't in 1989 either, although I think Prost ended up winning in 1989, didn't he?
Yes, Prost got the chocolates, you could say.
Nice.
Little plug till we got the chocolates. Everyone go over there, listen to them. They need some help. Probably not.
Thank you, Disc. Appreciate it.
But yeah, Prost got the championship that year with a fairly controversial finish to the season. At the Japanese Grand Prix, him and Senna had a little coming together.
Yes. What happened there? And what was the whole situation around that? Because we watched that documentary about him a couple of weeks ago, and it sounded like essentially if Senna finished that race, he would win, or if he finished that race, he could still win, or something like that.
Yeah, so I think he needed to beat Alan by just 1 point to stay in the championship for the next race.
Okay.
To like take the championship to the final race of the season. Or if Senna had won the race and Alan didn't finish, Senna would have won the championship. I think it was something around that.
Right.
Whereas from Alan's side of the garage, he knew that if Senna didn't finish and pick up a point, that he would win the championship, because there wouldn't be enough points left for Senna in the final race to win, regardless of if Prost didn't finish. So yeah, the controversy kind of comes as they were entering a chicane. Senna was chasing him down, and he made a move down the inside and was obviously faster than Prost at this point. Like he was all over the back of his gearbox for so long, and then he kind of sends this move down the inside from very far away. Like he was side by side with him for a fair amount of time. It was a very good move. And then before the apex of the corner, Prost just decides to turn early and hit Senna.
As you do.
Yeah. Now Prost describes it as, I might have been taking a slightly tighter line, but it was my corner. I was on the racing line. I'm allowed to take a tighter line and defend my position if I want to. There are a lot of videos on YouTube about this exact crash. People have done overheads and they've recreated it with sims and things like that, to show that like if Alan had taken the line he was on, he would have like cut the corner and he wouldn't have made the apex properly. Like his car would have gone the curb would have gone through the middle of his car kind of thing. So he would have like been very much on the grass.
Okay.
So there was a lot of stuff around Prost hitting Senna on purpose to take him out of the race.
Okay.
This damaged Prost's car. Prost couldn't continue, and pretty much immediately after the crash got out his car and jumped over the barrier.
Retired,
yeah. Whereas Senna was so dedicated to win that he was like telling the marshals like, push me forward, push me, like gesturing, like push me forward. And they did. They kind of pushed it. He got the car started again, went through the tire barrier, bollard kind of slalom, and carried on the race. Slalom. You never?
Slalom.
Yeah,
No.
Like slalom.
Never heard of it.
I swear that's a word. Let's just pause the pod for this. Let's probably not pause the pod because I don't know how to spell. We'll get into that later. So he kind of went through them, carried on, pitted, new front wing, new tires, and then went on to win the race. only for the FIA to strip him of his win and penalise him and fine him and give him a hefty suspension.
Yes. Nice.
Which makes no sense.
Okay. Yeah. So as if the crash sort of weren't controversial enough.
Yep.
And that happens. What was the reasoning? So he's just started racing again and seemingly won the race. What went wrong?
Well, so the FIA disqualified him from the race and this was post-race, so he'd finished, got out of his car, and then they kind of called him upstairs and disqualified him. The reason they gave was that at the point where he was at the tyres, he didn't complete the race distance because he cut through the chicane. So by cutting the chicane, he missed that turn. So he missed a few, would have been like point something of a kilometre or point something of a mile or whatever. So by missing that, he didn't complete the same race distance as everyone else, which is just for qualification, is what they said. The problem is that there were countless examples prior to this incident where people had used the escape road to escape from a crash and not injure themselves. And they've gone through the slalom of tyre barriers and have lost time by doing that, and then have carried on and finished the race and have never been disqualified. So it was kind of the FIA, kind of like they did with Fernando a few weeks back, plucking something straight out their arseholes and saying, here's a penalty.
All right. So they were the controversial circumstances.
You're supposed to say, Dave, tell me what you really think about it.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. So that was sort of the controversial way that Prost won in 89. And yeah, I suppose that, it certainly didn't seem like Senna loved that from the old FIA, did they? But I mean, he raced again in 1990 and ended up winning there.
There was serious contemplation from him, though, apparently, to not compete in 1999. He, apparently Ron Dennis called him up and he was like, nah, I think I'm just going to leave it there, kind of thing.
Yeah, didn't he go drive Indy cars for a bit?
Oh, did he?
I thought he did.
He definitely would have done some testing. I don't know if he would have done a full Indy season. Right. Well, he couldn't have done because he raced again, but he definitely would have done some driving. In his spare time, he would drive a lot of different things. Right, he just loved racing. Okay. Like Fernando.
As you do. And then the 1990 season ended kind of weirdly similarly.
Yeah. Same track.
What happened?
Same drivers.
Yeah.
There was a crash.
Yes. Yeah. At this point, Prost had moved from McLaren over to Ferrari, right? Because their rivalry had been fairly intense. Not the best.
Yeah. I think the quote was, "It becomes impossible to work with him meaning Senna."
Yep.
Prost said, and so he left McLaren, and also McLaren protested the thing in '89. So the team had lost faith in the driver had lost faith in the team, and it was time for him to move to Ferrari. Which was not a bad move. Ferrari were a very good team and were looking good for the 1990 season. So, great move for Alan. And all season long, them two just fucking battled every race. And it was trading wins, trading positions all the time. Until we end up in Japan. Penultimate race, championship decider. This time, let's reverse the what needs to happen kind of thing. Senna needs Alan to not finish, and Alan needs to finish above Senna to keep the championship alive into the next race. Turn 1, Senna pulls a move which is very similar to what he did with Martin Brundle in the Formula 3 World Championship by sending one down the inside where there was definitely no room to send one. Well, there was room, but it was a closing wedge.
So he left it fairly late, it looked.
Yeah, very late. Yeah. He also, I don't think, eased off the throttle or braked that heavily into the corner. You could almost say that Senna took Alain Prost out of the race on purpose.
It did seem that way. In fact, I think didn't Senna, he eventually admitted that was pretty much the case.
Yeah, I think it was a year later he admitted to
he was just never going to give up that corner. No. And he knew that meant that they would crash.
Yeah.
And he just backed it in.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think he did it in one of the safer places. You're not at full speed at that point. You're going very fast still, but you're probably not at full speed after starting the race off the line.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly big runoff zone with a fairly heavy gravel trap and tyre barriers afterwards. So if you're going to crash into your rival, there's worse places to do it.
Okay.
Alan's was definitely safer the year before, but Senna definitely had a point to prove against the FIA, against Alan, and against probably everyone else on the grid to show he wasn't a pushover.
Okay. And that situation with the FIA was made even worse in the lead up to this race, wasn't it?
Yes.
There was debate around what side of the track P1 would start on.
Well, Yeah, sorry. So they originally used to race as you would look at the grid. First place would start on the right-hand side. And so if you're looking from the first corner, looking back at the grid, first place would start on the right-hand side. Second place would start on the left. And for this season, they had flipped it. I don't know why. And Senna, after getting pole, well, no, I think even before he got pole, he was very off it. He was like disputing that it was laid out wrong and like calling for it to be changed. And then after he got pole position, was definitely like screaming at people to change the side of the grid, which they didn't do.
Yep.
And then, because basically off the line, Alan started in P2, Senna was in P1. Alan, being on the better side of the grid, got a far better start, overtook Senna immediately.
Yeah.
Whether Senna, again, like it's just no one, I don't think anyone will ever know this, but did Senna purposefully have a bad start so that Alan would pass so that he could hit him? Who knows? Because,
Sure.
I wouldn't put it past him.
Okay. All right. And then, so obviously like that sort of crash, like you just deliberately crashing to make sure you get the win and just refusing to give up that corner is again sort of that ruthless style of driving that he was known for.
Yeah.
But I guess not everyone was such a massive fan of that. I think there was an interview with Jackie Stewart, who you told me a little bit about, but we probably need to do another episode on him at some point.
Jackie's got a very fascinating life and still is around F1. But we've got an interview with Jackie Stewart. Goes like this.
He moved to the inside line, going towards the first corner. I just chased him then, and he opened the gap. And knowing me, like he does know, he must realize that if there was a gap, I was going to try to overtake him.
Right, but that only happened, Ayrton, because you saw the gap, and I accept that, you're a racer. But a mature racer has to also think, if he closes the door again, we're going to have an accident. And in fact, that was a high-speed entry, so it could have been a very serious accident.
Absolutely.
So wouldn't it not have been more prudent under those circumstances to have at least seen that the gap was potentially going to close?
Not at all.
Let me ask you another difficult question. If I were to count back all the world champions, and after all this is the 500th Grand Prix, that if you totaled up all of those great champions, the number of times they had made contact with other drivers, that you in the last 36 months or 48 months have been in contact with more other cars and drivers than they might have done in total.
I find amazing for you to make such a question, Stuart, because you are very experienced and you know a lot about racing. And you should know that by being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And by being a racing driver means you are racing with other people. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. Because we are competing to win. And the main motivation to all of us is to compete for a victory. It's not to come third, fourth, fifth, or sixth.
Yeah. So he was locking in the defense hard to say 12 months later, he then said, I did it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know, still that attitude of if you don't go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. That is,
it's probably one of the most famous quotes in motorsport, I would say.
Yeah, crikey.
Something interesting about this before we move on. Senna was pissed with Jackie. They were good friends before this. He was so pissed with Jackie that he vowed never to speak to Jackie again in an interview or ever. And then a year later he phoned Jackie up and like apologized and said, he was sorry for everything. And he said to him on the phone, he was like, I want to help improve driver safety and safety within the sport, which is what Jackie was working towards and still works towards nowadays. And I think he had a bit of a realization a year later in Japan when he had a crash at pretty much the same corner. I think it was the same corner, but a touch later on. He realized then that that the sport could be dangerous, and what he did in this accident was a fairly dangerous thing to do. And so he apologized and learned his lesson. And that's what I'm talking about with the growing up thing. Like he had to learn these. He went through shit like this to learn that you probably don't do that.
Okay. So that was 1990 was his second win, and then in 1991 he won his third and final world championship with McLaren again.
Yeah. Yeah, so 91 went into the season. He went into the season fairly confident. Ferrari hadn't delivered a car that was going to compete like it would the year prior, and so it was looking like he was going to win the world championship again. it was certainly a year for him where he became a more rounded driver. All of these kind of like rough edges of, wanting to take people out and going for moves that probably don't exist and things like that, like they started to slowly disappear from his driving style, and he became a lot more finessed in what he was doing. So you look at his 1990 season as like almost everything that had happened in 99 built up all this tension and stress within him, and then winning the world championship in 1990 was a massive relief of stress. And he could then focus on things outside of the sport, and he could focus on things in the sport that he necessarily hadn't focused on before, like safety aspects or becoming a more rounded driver and being more consistent throughout a season and things like that, which he needed to do to win. If he wanted to become a 4, 5, 6-time world champion, he knew he needed to do that. And 91 was definitely the season that helped him towards that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one notable race in 1991 was Brazil, wasn't it? Because he, obviously he'd had a bunch of success already, but had still never managed to win a home Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Right.
He'd had some close calls and either crashed or had engine problems or just didn't have the pace over the full race. But yeah, this was his first Brazil Grand Prix win. Yeah. And it was intense. I can't remember what lap it was, but he was winning the race. I think it started to rain as well, which obviously Senna in the rain, just fucking unreal. So he was like, there's like footage of him like pointing to the sky when it starts to rain and stuff because he just frothed it. But at some point in the race, his gearbox got jammed or something broke within his gearbox. So he was stuck in 6th gear. But yeah, he finished the race in 6th gear and won the race in 6th gear, which was just unreal. And I don't understand how he went through some of them corners, how he did pit stops and things like that by being in 6th. Like if you've ever driven a manual car and you've ever tried to take off in 2nd gear, it's hard enough. Yeah. You've got to get some revs up. So like to do that in a V12 Formula 1 car where like you're idling at probably 8,000 revs, like it's very difficult. So yeah, it was an insane win. Shortly after he had crossed the finish line, he had a spasm in his shoulders, I think it was. And so like he stopped the car and the doctors kind of had to help him around, and he was like in a lot of pain. And there's like a very famous video of him lifting the Brazil flag and lifting the trophy on the podium and stuff. And just, yeah, this was kind of the little finesse, the little cherry on top for the Brazilian fans and country to just adore him, was him winning. I think if he had won before this in Brazil, I don't think it would have been as iconic. I think the fact it took him till his last world championship and late on in the season for him to win at the Brazilian Grand Prix and then to win in this way, I think it just made it way more iconic for him, for Brazil, for the sport.
And then 92, 93... not as much success. Williams.
Come on.
Here we go.
I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. We get to talk about Williams being good.
Yeah. So Williams start dominating. What the heck happened? What did they do?
So yeah, Frank and Patrick Head, the kind of like spearheads at that team and they also had an amazing technical team and aerodynamic team and an amazing group of people behind them. They had come up with what they called active suspension. So the suspension, there's a video of the car sat in the pits and it's kind of moving on its own, mimicking what the curbs are going to do on that track. So they could scan the tracks and add in the bumps that were in the track or add in the curbs that were in the track so that the suspension would keep the car at a consistent ride height throughout the track and it would flow with the track. So what pretty much you could get in that car, put your foot on the throttle, give it a slight bit of turn each corner, but the car would do the rest. It was on rails, essentially.
Right.
It was an insane piece of technology. And I think if you watch any of the Williams on boards from that year, you'll be impressed just by how, in fact, there's a shot of Senna, I think actually might be Brazil after turn 1-2, going onto the straight after there. And Senna's kind of like closed the gap in on the corner, but then the corner exiting speeds for Nigel and whoever his teammate was that season was just fucking unbelievable. And they just like fly out the corner. And it's because of this technology that they had introduced. Go Williams.
Okay, good on him. And then, yeah, so in that period, so Williams is dominating, Senna's not dominating.
Yep.
And he's just sort of openly speaking about the fact that he's pretty keen to head over to Williams in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Senna at this point in his career was, he was probably the most famous person in the sport. He had so much pull on the sport that he could pretty much, just like Lewis now, can pretty much say or do whatever he wants and will pretty much get away with it. And so he was openly talking to interviewers and to other teams about his contract with Williams that he was in discussion with for the 93 season. I don't think he knew for 92 it was going to be that good. I think 92 was the eye-opener for him to go, oh shit, they've got something here. I want to be in that car for 93. He was very vocal. The thing that stopped him was Alain Prost, who had been sacked by Ferrari in 91 for calling the car shit. So Ferrari sacked him, which led to him not having to drive in 92, which was probably the best thing for him because then he was one of the first people to start talking to Williams for 93. And he actually got a veto on Senna or Mansell signing for Williams for 93. So he would be the lead driver.
Gotcha. All right. So Prost goes on to win in 93, but it was 93. We finally see the lap of the gods.
Yes.
So what is this all about?
You've not seen this yet, have you?
No.
Okay, good, because we're going to watch it. We're going to watch it on the pod. So lap of the gods, as I previously mentioned, it's at Donington, my home track. It's literally just down the road. It's like next to the airport where like our local airport.
Sure.
So many fond memories at this track. Unfortunately, they got rid of the like extra section with the hairpin. You used to have a big Foster's can on the infield of the hairpin. It was amazing. Senna was obviously like we've said, the Williams was so much better. Senna was still in the McLaren. He was starting, I think, in 4th or 5th, so fairly low down. The Williams were in P1 and 2, and just before the race, it started to rain. That is all of the background I'm going to give you.
When you see the red, it will be from 4 to 7 seconds before the green and the start of the 76th lap. European Grand Prix. Prost gets away.
Senna in 4th.
So does Hill, so does Schumacher. And Wendlinger is coming up. Well, Senna is crowded.
So Senna now in 5th.
Down to 5th position. And Wendlinger is up into 3rd place ahead of Schumacher. Brilliant start by the Austrian driver in the black Sauber. Prost leads. Hill 2nd. Wendlinger is 3rd. And Ayrton Senna is up to 4th position ahead of Schumacher and challenging Wendlinger as they go round the right-hander into the old hairpin. Senna is up to 3rd.
And after being crowded at the start, a quite brilliant couple of corners by Ayrton Senna. Tremendous stuff. He muscled his way back into contention at Redgate. He's going inside Damon Hill. And Senna into 2nd place already. And he's giving it absolutely everything in the wet part of the race.
So now, as before, the 2 great rivals, and that's Andretti. He's done it again on the very first lap. Andretti is out as he was in Brazil, as he almost was in South Africa. 3 Grand Prix, and he has only done 3 full laps. And so out is Wendlinger. So 2 retirements already. Michael Andretti and Carl Wendlinger. And Senna goes through into the lead. He's passed Alain Prost, so the McLaren leads. Prost 2nd, Hill is 3rd. A tremendous gap between the 3rd and 4th cars.
Yes, and that must be caused by the Andretti and Wendlinger incident. We would assume that they may have had a coming together. We'll try and find out. Senna going away, but I expect that Damon Hill will be looking for a way past his team leader, Alain Prost, who doesn't like the wet and won't be in a hurry.
To end it on that save as well.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, I thought for sure he was going there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in 1 lap, he was into turn 1 5th. His teammate, another driver, both spun out because they just aquaplaned and just lost control of the car. We saw Alain Prost struggling in a Williams that could basically drive itself. And yet Senna just managed to keep that on the track faster than anyone else. And also doing lines different to everyone else. Like when people were trying to find the dry line, Senna was going onto a wet line and still making overtaking moves happen.
Right, okay.
It's hard to say you'll never see a lap like that again because we've had some very, very good laps in the wet since that. But at that point, that was just unbelievable.
Okay. I see.
And it was at my local track, so it makes it even better.
And then so 93, he finishes with McLaren.
Yeah.
And I think the last race is in Australia and he manages to beat Prost.
Yeah. Yeah, he beat Prost. Senna was first, Prost was second.
Yeah, so the last race of the season, 1993, ends up being his.
I feel like that was also a wet weather race. I feel like there was a bit of rain around that one. Not 100%, but I would imagine him beating Prost there was probably rain assisted as well.
Okay. And that eventually becomes his last win.
Yeah.
Ever.
And also the last time that Prost and Senna would both stand on the podium together. So this brings us on to the 1994 season, which would, it turns out, be Senna's last season with us or in Formula One or anything. After that, like you just said, racing Australia, Senna had signed a contract for the 94 season. After Alain had won the championship, he decided to retire. That was Alain's fourth championship. So Senna took his seat in the Williams, and just ahead of the season start, the FIA had decided in an attempt to bring the field closer together, they were going to ban certain things on the car that was specifically on the Williams car, which led to them dominating, which was the active suspension, the traction control, and the ABS. I'm sure there was a certain level of traction control they had, but it wasn't the full traction control that the Williams had the previous season. So they had to kind of go back to an older system, which they weren't used to.
Okay.
Which obviously led to them struggling in the very early parts of the season. There was also refueling was introduced back into the sport for the 94 season so that people could run different fuel strategies, lighter cars, heavier cars, different kind of stints, which would lead to some very interesting strategies. So there's a lot of excitement around this being introduced, but there was also a lot of annoyance from the Williams clan that they were losing their amazing inventions. Senna and his teammate Damon Hill very uncomfortable in the car early doors because the car that that Damon had driven the season before with Alain and the car that Senna was expecting to drive was not there, and Williams had just produced a car that wasn't as consistent as the McLaren that Senna was driving the year before or the years before that. It wasn't as on the ball, even though like the McLaren didn't have that technology, but was still competitive kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't consistent like that because they'd had to strip all this stuff off preseason. Mm-hmm. You've got a quote here from Senna. I think it was preseason. Yeah,
exactly. Well, at the start of that season, I suppose because of that, he's feeling pretty uncomfortable in the car and just lacking confidence in it. I just found this astounding at the start of the season. He said, "I have a very negative feeling about driving the car and driving it on the limit. Some of that is down to the lack of electronic change. Also, the car has its own characteristics, which I'm not fully confident in yet. All very fine." Then it goes on to say, "It's going to be a season with a lot of accidents, and I'll risk saying that we'll be lucky if something really serious doesn't happen."
Yeah. It's quite an ominous quote, isn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Anyways, the first two races of the season, the car must have been okay because he managed to put it on pole in both races.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I think this is the thing. And again, this shows the determination of Senna is that he probably worked very, very hard with his team. And obviously the team worked very hard to get it to a point where they could at least drive it quickly. So I think on a 1 lap pace, like they were obviously quick, and Senna being Senna could always pull out 1 lap. Like he was known for being like the best on a 1 lap kind of performance.
Yeah, well, didn't he finish with the most poles of anyone at the time?
At the time, yeah.
He poled he finished on pole 65 times.
Yeah,
ridiculous.
Yeah, it was a crazy stat, and it just shows just how good he was at just that kind of like that natural skill of just making everything he drove fast. And yeah, this was definitely not his time at Williams was definitely not, against the ordinary of what he would do. So these pole laps were kind of to be expected. Mm-hmm. It is still insane that he would have these pole laps and then like in his first 2 races, he didn't end up finishing. The first one, I think he span out and ended up stalling the car.
Yep.
It's crazy that you can put it on pole and then have a spin that was kind of, he couldn't even explain why the spin happened because the car was just so imbalanced.
Yeah.
And then in the second race, he was rear-ended going into turn 1 by a Ferrari. I think it was. So yeah, he had a really good start to the season if you look at it from his qualifying performance, but he had 0 points going into Imola. So like his 16 race championship was effectively a 14 race championship. I think there was a quote from him saying that ahead of Imola as well. Like, our championship starts here. We have a 14 race championship. Michael Schumacher has a 16 race championship.
Yep. And at the time, Schumacher was killing it, basically.
Yeah, the Benetton it had very good aerodynamics. It had very good technical abilities, and Michael was what Senna was to Prost. He was the new kid on the block who had kind of nothing to lose and was taking it very, very seriously. Michael took what Senna did from a performance and personal point of view and just amplified it. He would take his physical fitness so seriously. It was unreal. And so this was kind of the first time in Senna's career that he had experienced a new young driver come into the sport and actually challenge him because on the physical, on the mental, and on the natural skill kind of ability. So that, partnered with the Benetton's great car that they had, put Senna under a fair amount of pressure.
Okay. So they're heading into the third race of the season, the San Marino Grand Prix at the Imola track in Italy.
Yeah.
Talk me through it.
Yeah, so it was a fairly wild weekend. Friday practice, we saw Rubens Barrichello, fellow Brazilian, huge fan of Senna. He had a fairly big accident in the practice session where he kind of came off the track, hit the wall. He kind of like jumps up off the curb and nose dives into the wall. It's a very big impact. And when you look at that, you're like, whoa, he's going to be seriously injured. Senna actually visited him at the medical center on the track. He had fairly heavy bruising, wasn't seriously injured, but decided that he wasn't going to race for the weekend because of how intense that accident was.
Yep.
So that happened on the Friday practice session. We then move on to the Saturday qualifying, the 30th of April. During the second qualifying session that we had, Roland Ratzenberg was driving in the Simtech MTV car, had a very substantial accident, and he lost his life during this accident. Just wanted to go a little bit into the history of Roland Ratzenberg. He was an Austrian driver he was an Austrian driver who raced in Formula Ford in 83, and in 85, he won both the Austrian and Central European Formula Ford championships. So a very impressive driver, early doors. In the 90s, he raced predominantly in Japan in some sports car prototype racing. And in 1990 and 1991, he took the championship at both of them. He also raced 5 times in Le Mans from 89 through to 93. And any driver that has raced Le Mans will tell you it's a fucking hard race. So to even compete in Le Mans is a crazy achievement. And I would imagine back then, not as comfortable as it is now. So an amazing achievement to do it back then. In 94, he finally got his race seat in Formula One, joining the Simtech team, as I previously mentioned. He'd failed to qualify for the first race of the season. So back then we would have like 30 plus cars would try and enter a weekend, and they would do a pre-qualifying qualifying, and the top 26 cars from that would then go through to the actual Grand Prix qualifying and would compete in the Grand Prix weekend. So the first one, his team didn't succeed in making it through to the actual Grand Prix. I think he only just missed out. I can't remember where he was, but he only just missed out from that. And then in the actual qualifying, and then in the second race, he did qualify and he finished a very respectable P11. For a team that didn't qualify in the previous race to then finish P11 of a potential 26 car grid is very impressive, I would say.
Yeah.
And also first ever race in Formula One, finishing P11.
Awesome.
Going into Imola on the Friday session, he was fairly concerned about his brakes. I think he spoke to his teammate about the brakes in the car, and they had the mechanics kind of look over everything, did test laps and things like that, and confirmed the brakes were fine. And in the second qualifying session, he had a little spin which caused damage to his front wing. He didn't quite realize the extent of the damage, and then continued to go around the track. Going around the Villeneuve corner, the front wing failed and came off the car, kind of sliding underneath from what I can gather, which led him to come off the track and hit the wall at 314.9 kilometers, resulting in one of the biggest crashes in F1 history at roughly 500 Gs. of impact force, which, as we have seen on this podcast, looking at the Romain Grosjean crash a few years back, is what was that, 76 or or something? Yeah. And this is, over 5 times that. It's it's an insane crash. And obviously this crash cost him his life. Murray Walker was the person to break the news to the world at the track. I think it was on the Saturday night or the Sunday morning. He broke the news to the world about Ratzenberg dying in the crash the day before. And this is how he did it.
I sadly have to report that the news is bad. 20 minutes into the 1-hour session, the very popular Austrian driver, Roland Ratzenberger, and we have just had the very sad news that he has succumbed to his injuries.
So that brings us to the Sunday race day. The morning of the Sunday race day, Senna was obviously distraught. He'd visited Ratzenberg's crash site and had seen the aftermath of what had happened. And he was, I think his girlfriend and his mum and things had spoken to media after years later and had said that that morning and that evening, he went back to his hotel and was visibly shook and in tears and was breaking down and things like that, to the point where the Williams team, including Frank and Patrick Head, they didn't know whether or not he was going to even attend the race. They were concerned that it had shocked him that much because it had been so long since we'd had a death in the sport. I think what did you say? Was it like 10 years or something?
Yeah, I think it was, this was 94. I think it was 86 was the one before, maybe.
So it had been a very long time since we'd had a death. And so, the Williams team were unsure whether he was going to even compete in the race the following day. And after the Ratzenberg crash as well, Professor Sid Watkins, who was a really good friend of Senna's, after Senna had visited the medical center and things like that, Professor Sid Watkins had said to him, hey, why don't we just pack it in? Why don't we just, leave F1, go fishing and just enjoy our life? I think the quote was something like, you're a 3-time world champion. You've got nothing to prove. Let's go fishing, something like that.
Yeah.
And Senna replied back to him, I can't quit. I have to go on. He was just determined that he was going to be a world champion again. He was going to be a 4-time world champion, and he didn't want to stop racing. So he got in the car and he carried on racing. At the start of the race, it was already a fairly bad race to begin with, because off the line, Leto in a Benetton had stalled his car, and Pedro Lamy had been kind of blindsided other cars rushing around the stalled car. He drove into the back of it and kind of got launched over the top of his car. Neither driver injured, luckily, but it was a very spectacular crash to see. Fairly high, it was a fairly big crash, debris everywhere, and not a great way to start the race after what we've already had. Because of this, they dropped the safety car, and the safety car went out for 5 laps, going back into the pits on lap 6, when they finally got racing again, and on lap 7, when they were on their first full lap of racing speed. Tyre temps were finally getting back up after they'd been significantly dropped under the safety car, which Senna was complaining about. There's a shot of Senna pulling alongside the safety car and kind of signaling go faster, go faster. He was losing temperature in his tyres fairly quickly. So on lap 7, Schumacher was catching up with Senna, was hot on his tail, and we approached the Tamburello corner, which is a swooping left-hander corner, and Senna kind of drove. He was not naturally on the racing line. Schumacher had kind of said in an interview afterwards he was kind of a little bit off, and as the corner swooped around to the left, he continued to veer off of that line, eventually exiting the track and hitting the wall at a speed of 211 kilometers an hour, which is a huge impact. We've seen crashes in modern day Formula One worse than this, but back at this point, when Lewis drove Senna's McLaren of I think it was the 1990 McLaren, he said that the cockpit is so fragile that you could probably punch through the side of it.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of cars that Senna was driving in at this point. It was obviously a very big incident, and even just from the off-board camera shots, you could see that like Senna was not in a good way. He hit the wall very heavily, and as the car spun and like stopped, almost just on the edge of the track, you could see that his head had fallen to one side of the car, one side of the cockpit. Professor Sid Watkins was the first person to get on scene and the first person to examine him properly. And he said, he was quoted to say afterwards, he looked serene. I raised his eyelids and it was clear from his pupils that he had a massive brain injury. We lifted him from the cockpit and laid him on the ground. As we did, Senna sighed. Although I'm not religious, I felt that was his spirit departing him. Oh, disc. So then that evening, skin. Fuck.
Go disc.
So that evening, the BBC announced his death.
The former world motor racing champion Ayrton Senna has been pronounced clinically dead after a crash at this afternoon's San Marino Grand Prix. Senna suffered serious head injuries when his car left the track and crashed into a concrete wall. He's being kept on a life support machine because of Italian law, but a spokesman for the hospital in Bologna said there was no chance he would survive.